What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm going to start my cube review of Lorwyn Eclipsed. I'll be talking about the set's themes and mechanics and some examples of what's going on there. But before I dive in, I do have to get a little political. And when I say have to, I do literally mean that I have to, because you can choose to talk about what is happening in the world of politics and the world around you, or you can choose not to. But if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. Whether you talk about what's happening in the world or you don't, you are contributing your voice to whatever path you pursue. If you pursue being apolitical, an apolitical stance is still a political stance. You probably know that I am a resident of Minneapolis. If you've been paying attention to US news at all, you're aware of what is happening in Minneapolis right now. We are under occupation by federal officers who are abducting, harassing, even killing our neighbors. Renee Good was killed last week. And since then, DHS has only escalated the conflict. They are using flashbang grenades, tear gas, pepper spray, just on ordinary citizens. The thing that is heartening about what is happening is how many ordinary people are standing up to the injustice happening in Minneapolis right now. And I understand there might be people that don't agree with me politically. I'll say if you are vehemently against what I'm saying, advocating for ordinary people here, don't listen to my podcast. Just turn this off right now. Ignore my stuff. I'm not for you. I do not make this for you. It's day and night who is right and who is wrong in this. And as such, I do just want to share some resources and just call, if you have any money or time to contribute, the good people at Good Luck High Five are doing a fundraiser right now for some local mutual aid organizations, doing a bit of a giveaway too. And I'm also just going to post some other local organizations. I'm living in a community that is hurting, that is grieving. We are showing up and showing out for each other. It is really heartening to see the bravery and the kindness of my neighbors in light of the horrors that are being imposed upon us. If you have the ability to contribute to any of those organizations, I would greatly appreciate it. But I also want to acknowledge that Minneapolis is not the only place in the country where this is happening. And certainly not the only place in the world. I don't want to pretend. I know that I have an international audience. I don't want to say what's happening where I live is the only important thing happening. It's just something that really impacts me. Here in the States, of course, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, Portland, Chicago, they have all been under similar occupations, and Minneapolis is not going to be the last place. This is not going to stop so long as the people currently in power continue to just unapologetically impose their violent will upon us. And in this time, it really feels like the only thing that we have is each other. I would really appreciate any support you can give to my community. And otherwise, I would encourage you to look into mutual aid in your own community. This is a time where the cost of groceries is really high, where healthcare premiums are skyrocketing in light of recent policy decisions that you might generously call negligence, which I think you could accurately call violence against our citizenry. People are finding themselves hungry, unhoused, hurting in all kinds of ways through no fault of their own from a system that is designed to benefit the exorbitantly wealthy, that is only helping the wealthy even more and turning a blind eye to us ordinary people who really only have each other to fall back on. Nobody is coming to save us, but I do have a lot of heart just seeing the bravery of the actions of ordinary people. I think that there are more of us decent and kind people than there are the cruel sycophants and power-seeking monsters who are making these things happen. And I believe that together we will win. We do need to look out for each other. So if you could contribute to things happening in Minneapolis, that would really warm my heart. If you can look out for your own community, if you just spend some time looking at what organizations in your own community there are to contribute, even that step would mean a lot to me, because right now we really do need each other. It's not just Minneapolis that's hurting right now. It's not just major population centers. I know that a lot of people are hurting, and it is our obligation to look out for our neighbors because we really only have each other. So be excellent to your neighbors, be kind and patient. People are going through a lot right now. I appreciate you taking a couple minutes to listen to me here, and I would greatly appreciate you contributing either to my community or your own and just being a mindful citizen of the world. I know that it feels like a great imposition when just out of nowhere all of these monsters are in power. It's overwhelming, it's scary. There's a lot going on, and you might feel powerless. But you do have power and you do have choices to make. And together we have a lot of power. So it's really important that we look out for each other and that we stand together in these times. All right, let's talk about Lorwyn or whatever. Lorwyn Eclipse marks Magic's first return to the aesthetically beloved yet mechanically fraught original block of Lorwyn in 2007. This return certainly seems to have learned the lessons of the unnecessary complexity of giving every creature two creature types that matter, but does maintain a strong typal identity as we return to the plane with modern sensibilities. The set is being released alongside two corresponding commander decks. There is Dance of the Elements, a 5-color elemental deck, and Blight Curse, a 3-color Jund deck built around -1/-1 counter synergies. Blight Curse has some okay stuff, nothing that really jumps off the page. I think that the Reaper King No More is a very cool design, but it's just not all that efficient. Seems like more of a modest commander thing. I think Ashling the Limitless is a really cool elemental design, but this stuff is all really niche. Check that out if you play with -1/-1 counters in your cube as a big theme, or if you're into elementals. I will say the elemental deck, Ashling, could definitely play if you're doing 5-color elementals in your cube. A lot of the stuff in this deck, though, is just really statted and rated for a commander. There's stuff that has these 9, 8, and 9 mana encore abilities, which is not much of a thing in 2-player environments, but it could be in your cube specifically. If you're into big mana elemental stuff, check that out. There's some nice cards. There's very few that are going to end up on my highlight reel, and I'm just going to lump this in with the main set. I'll make a note when I'm talking about cards from the commander decks, but spoilers, it's not going to be any of the cards I talk about today, and on next week's episode about individual cards, it is just going to be a couple of lands. So not a ton going on in the commander decks, which is fine. Let's talk about what's going on in the main set. There are a handful of significant returning mechanics from Lorwyn Eclipsed. You're going to see a lot of Evoke, Convoke, Wither, and Persist showing up. Also that Kindred typal theme. You're going to see all of the creature types that had some synergies in original Lorwyn, at least the races showing up here with some amount of support. Kithkin, Merfolk, Elementals, Goblins, Elves, Giants, Treefolk. If you play with any of these creature types as a synergistic aspect of your cube environment, I would generally recommend just doing the Scryfall search for that creature type in this set, because there's going to be cards that are going to appeal to you that I don't think are really worth a lot of time highlighting because they're not really going to penetrate the broader world of cube. I think that the loudest designs in this set are going to be goblins and elves. I think there's pretty solid support for both of those creature types. Elementals gets a little bit. I think there's a lot of elementals, and there's in fact a full cycle that I think is very appealing for elementals. So goblins, elves, and elementals, those are going to be the big winners. There's some merfolk stuff, and merfolk is a creature type that largely is trying to get on the battlefield, play on volume. There's some cool fairies. I guess I didn't mention fairies on my list. Fairies are here too, though there's very little that really makes fairies seem appealing outside of retail limited. I think they might have played a little bit hesitantly to really push fairies after what happened in the previous Lorwyn block. If you weren't playing back in 2007, fairies was the dominant archetype for block constructed and also was significantly dominant for a long stretch of standard when the cards were legal. I don't really see anything that looks to me on first blush to be problematic with any of these creature types, and mostly just looks like cool things to explore if you care about any of these creature types, which is refreshing. It's great. I do like seeing modest support, so if you are a fan of any of these creature types, there's definitely going to be some cards for you to check out and incorporate in your cube environments. Notably, Kindred as a card type shows up in Lorwyn, but just a light touch of it. I think that the designers and developers were being mindful of Kindred just being kind of a fake card type that shows up to support Delirium and Lurgoyf kind of stuff. And when I say fake, I mean that you can just slop Kindred on any card and then it suddenly has an extra type just so it can have a creature type. It really feels like a super type, not a card type, so the fact that it plays in Delirium often just feels like you're playing a handful of niche cards for explicitly that purpose, and if you make too many of them, then suddenly everything that cares about card types in graveyards or card types really in any zone where you could check them and count them for anything just does not feel like you're working for it. And I do want to commend the Lorwyn Eclipsed design team because it feels like they had a very modest touch for this and introduced cards that generally seem like they would play in decks that care specifically about those card types. I want to call attention to a cycle of cards. There's a cycle of commands in Lorwyn Eclipse. There are five of them, but they're not all enemy or ally colors. They do line up with the shocklands that are being printed into this set into standard, so they've been doing less ally versus enemy lines. I think that a lot of newer players wouldn't even necessarily know what I'm talking about, the way that they split up dual land cycles and two color support these days. It's not that important, especially if they're not abiding by it as much. But anyway, this is a cycle of five kindred, either instants or sorceries. They'll have a creature type. There's one for elementals, that's your blue-red entry in Ashling's command. One for Kithkin, that's your green-white in Brigad's command. Goblin in red-black as Grub's command. Merfolk in blue-white as Sig's command. And Elf in green-black as Tristan's command. All of these kindred commands have four modes. You choose two of them, and the first of each of them is create a token that's a copy of target of the corresponding creature type you control. So the first mode in Ashling's command is create a token of a copy of target elemental you control. And for that reason, if you're not really supporting these creature types, you fully have a mode, and it's the first line of text on the card that is going to communicate to players, even if there's other modes on the card that could be appealing. And some of them are fine. I think like Ashling's command is generally playable for being an instant that can draw two cards and make two treasure tokens. Again, mostly this is going to be stuff in space where if you really care about this creature type, then you're going to want to know about these cards, and they're going to show up in your Scryfall search. If you search for every elemental, the kindred elemental command is going to show up in your search. So because they're so specific, I don't want to read down the line on all of them, but I do want to specifically highlight Tristan's command for a couple reasons. This is the green-black elf entry, and the reason I want to talk about it is because elves kind of most naturally shows up as a creature type. There's not a ton that green does in the history of Magic, and so mana elves tend to be a very common thing to see in cubes. And I think that the way that this card plays is going to be very welcome in a lot of green, certainly green-black decks if you fully go on green-black elf decks in Cube. But this is the one I think is most likely going to slot into just an existing list, even if it's just taking a light touch with elves. So here's what the card does. For green-black, for a kindred sorcery elf, choose to create a token. It's a copy of target elf you control. Return one or two target permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. Destroy target creature or enchantment, and creatures target player controls get +3/+3 until end of turn, untap them. So those middle modes, this is just like a fine mid-range card. You get a couple raised adds, you get to destroy a creature or an enchantment, and then this really plays in the space of a Llanowar Elf deck. That kind of overrun effect on the final mode, giving all your creatures +3/+3, that makes a lot of sense if you have a battlefield that's like Llanowar Elf, Devoted Druid. If you're otherwise leaning into elves, you can have things like Priest of Titania, Elvish Archdruid, so you can cast this using your creatures. You do get a discount because it untaps all the creatures you control. So this is going to play well in the elf space, and it's an overrun that plays really well just with any kind of mana creatures. It's two colors, so there's kind of an ask there. If you're not doing Golgari elves, if you just have a couple elves peppered in, I think there's enough going on that it could be appealing. The rate is kind of modest, though. Mostly this is for typo elves, but it's worth paying attention to if you're playing even a little bit in that space, which a lot of cubes tend to be. There's also a good spread of generic typal support that can play for any creature type. A couple examples of that: Bloodline Bidding, 6 black sorcery with Convoke, so a little bit cheaper than it says on the tin. Choose a creature type, return all creature cards of the chosen type from your graveyard to the battlefield. So the Convoke makes it a little bit cheaper than Patriarch's bidding. It's only your graveyard, so Bloodline bidding definitely a little bit stronger for kind of graveyard-based creature synergy decks, so that's a pretty cool one. There's Collective Inferno, an enchantment for 3 red red, also with Convoke. As this enchantment enters, choose a creature type. Double all damage that sources you control of the chosen type would deal. These kind of doubling effects, we have to use a lot of mana to do that. This tends to play a little bit more in the commander space, but for any red creature type, you can definitely use this as a payoff for some damage dealing. This is fine, just a normal cube. I do think that Bloodline bidding is a little bit easier to put in a cube just because it's a way to reset if you're fighting through some attrition, whereas Collective Inferno just kind of gets worse as your opponent kills your creatures, but there's certainly stuff you can do with this one. And Celestial Reunion is a really cool card in the typal space. So for green and X, it's a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may choose a creature type and behold 2 creatures of the same type. So behold is something we've seen a little bit more of recently. It means you either control a creature of that type or you can reveal one from your hand. And so 2, they can be split between either on the battlefield or in your hand, 1 in each. However you do that, you then search your library for a creature card with mana value X or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. If this spell's additional cost was paid, if you beheld those 2 creatures, and the revealed card is the chosen type, put that card onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your hand. So if you're in that elf space, this is kind of a Green Sun Zenith effect. You do need to be able to behold 2 creatures that share a type with what you're searching out, so it plays differently. Importantly, this can search for a creature of any color. You do really want to be beholding those 2 cards because if you're just putting it into your hand, this can be a really inefficient tutor. But some typal decks, or even just some like creature combo decks, they will use stuff for 1 and 2 mana that can be really powerful engines. 3 mana tutor for a Blood Artist is not the strongest card I've ever heard of if you're just putting it into your hand, but it's playable, certainly in some environments. This one is one worth knowing about. I would say that Celestial Reunion can play in any kind of cube that has a heavy typal theme, definitely if it's rooted in green. Once again, I want to call attention to the fact that a lot of cubes are going to already be flirting with this when it comes to elves in the green column. So one to pay a little bit of attention to, definitely if you're explicitly in the typal space, really cool design. We also see a sampling of changelings in the generic typal support space. They played it relatively safe here. A lot of the changelings are going to be modest rates for retail limited. It's not surprising to me that they didn't print any 1 mana changelings, giving the presence of Mox Jasper in standard. That could break in a lot of really unpleasant ways when you just make it so players have access to a Mox on turn number 1. Not the kind of thing you really want to see in a standard format, so I'm not surprised there. It might have been cool to see, but it also might have been a disaster. But with what we did get, there's a couple nice highlights. 2 that I want to call attention to are Chomping Changeling, 2 and a green for a 1/2 shapeshifter that of course counts as every creature type. When this creature enters, destroys up to 1 target artifact or enchantment. So Chomping Changeling is basically Reclamation Sage, except it's a 1/2 instead of a 2/1, and it counts as any creature type. 1/2 body, that can be meaningful in any environment where you have 1/1 tokens running around. Reclamation Sage is not known for being the best at attacking or blocking, just kind of trades with everything. So a 1/2 is oftentimes going to be stronger than a 2/1, certainly if both players are interested in attacking. And every creature type, that's going to make it so if you support Kithkin, if you support goblins, it's a dragon. So, that's something that can matter, albeit not the strongest thing to power out a Mox Jasper. But it still plays. I'm a pretty big fan of Chomping Changeling. And I am a huge fan of Mutable Explorer. Mutable Explorer is 2 and a green for a 1/1 changeling, and when it enters, create a tapped Mutavault token. Mutavault is a card originally from Morningtide, the first Lorwyn block. It's a land that can tap for colorless mana, and also for 1 generic mana, you can turn it into a 2/2 that counts as all creature types until end of turn. It's still a land when you do that. So this is kind of a Wood Elves, a 3-mana 1/1 that puts a land on the battlefield. It doesn't search your deck though, it just always gives you Mutavault. It gives you a creature land. So this card is really doing double duty. It's giving you two creatures of any type, albeit you do have to spend mana to turn the Mutavault into a creature, but if all you care about is Threshold, it can just tap and activate itself for that. And this is also a ramp spell. So you can really play it in any deck. I like that it plays with landfall and it also plays with Typal. There are a lot of reasons and potential synergies to include Mutable Explorer in really any cube, and it's also just giving you 3 power and toughness worth of card as well. So it just kind of plays as a normal card, and then it can open up into all kinds of synergies. I like this one a lot. Definitely, if your environment is trying to get players up to casting 5 and 6 spells, giving you a Mutavault token, it's not like the strongest form of flood insurance, but the fact that it gives you something to do with your mana, you have access to an extra creature, that's not nothing. Compare that to just playing Wood Elves and your hand only has so much follow up. That's kind of the classic ramp deck problem where you have mana acceleration and you have payoffs. And Mutable Explorer, it's not a payoff per se if you don't have other stuff with like landfall synergies to really give you more use out of the card, but it's something to do with your mana, and a 2/2 is it's not nothing. You can apply pressure, you can pad your life total with these things, and if you're exploring any kind of typal synergies, really even going wide in any capacity, this is two bodies after all. It's a land, it's a 1/1 and a 2/2. This card gives you a lot. I really like Mutable Explorer. It's one that I plan to try out in multiple of my own designs. Now let's talk about the new mechanics in Lorwyn, though notably this first one here, Vivid, is most significantly on the reprint of the card Bloom Tender. It just has the ability word Vivid for the first time. So what Vivid is it's an ability, it counts how many different colors among permanents you control there are, and then gives you something for that. This stuff is all largely rated for limited. There's only so much design space for it. You don't really want to print stuff that's 2 or more colors that just is a permanent that gives you 2 because it's not that interesting to explore this space. So I understand why there's not a ton of it, but there's a couple of cards I do want to shine some light on. The first is Explosive Prodigy, 1 and a red for a 1/1 elemental sorcerer. Has Vivid. When it enters, it deals X damage to target creature an opponent controls, where X is the number of colors among permanents you control. So in a 2-color deck, pretty reasonable for this to do 2 damage to something. Flametongue Yearling is a card that I've cubed with a little bit out of Modern Horizons. I don't love the double red on turn 2. It's also just really efficient at being a Flametongue Kavu, which can be pretty punishing for creature-based decks, really punishing against creatures that just attack and block, which I don't think you need to be hostile towards. That's just kind of a categorically weaker thing, and the kind of thing that I want to root for. But with Explosive Prodigy, getting permanents of multiple colors, a little bit more of a barrier to that over just ramping your mana. I like that this is the kind of card that will be okay in mono red, more of a sideboard card when you're playing against a lot of 1 toughness creatures, but then in a 2-color deck, Explosive Prodigy will more reliably be able to take something down or finish it off after something blocks one of your smaller creatures. And then it can scale a little bit into 3 to 5-color decks, but then it's not really doing anything all that more impressive than playing any kind of Doomblade effect. So it's kind of a neat one, very modest, but I do like Explosive Prodigy. And then the other Vivid card I want to talk about is Aurora Awakener, 6 and a green for a 7/7 giant druid with trample. Has Vivid. When it enters, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X permanent cards, where X is the number of colors among permanents you control. Put any number of those permanent cards onto the battlefield, then put the rest of the revealed cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. Notably, finding specifically permanents is a little bit weaker than flipping until you find spells, given that pretty much every deck is going to have lands, and that's going to be a pretty high volume of permanents for your Aurora Awakener to reveal and then put onto the battlefield in place of something stronger, which is probably you're looking for something that actually costs some amount of mana over just making a land drop on your giant 7/7. So this is the kind of thing where you can cheat this into play, sneak attack this in, reanimate this in. It plays okay in high power environments. Mostly, this is kind of a fun, swingy effect that you can put at the top of the curve. I would say for medium power cubes, if you want players to be casting 7 mana spells and give them a little value for doing it, this seems much more the space for Aurora Awakener than trying to cheat it onto the battlefield. It is kind of fun to flip the cards over. It's pretty deflating if all the bonus you get is just some lands. But this is also a pretty cool one. If you're playing in the Bloom Tender space, that one being a 2 mana 1/1 that can tap for a mana of all the color of your permanents, ramping this out and just actually getting the full 5 cards, you're probably getting something good there. So there's some potential for fireworks here. Not going to fit a lot of environments, but it's kind of a cool one. Another new mechanic in Lorwyn Eclipsed is going to be Blight. Blight says when a player blights, they put a number of -1/-1 counters spread among creatures they control, and Blight's used in a couple different ways in Lorwyn Eclipse. You can pay Blight as a cost, which means you have to have creatures to put -1/-1 counters on. You'll get some additional effect if you do that. Or there's implementations where you blight your opponent, forcing them to put -1/-1 counters spread among their creatures. So blighting your opponent, assuming they have multiple creatures, they're going to have some agency in how that resolves. Unless you do it a ton of times, it's not necessarily the most powerful thing. And also paying blight as a cost, this is definitely something that is rated and designed largely for retail limited, but there are a couple cool designs here that I want to highlight. The first is an Elf Matter cards. I said I was not really going to talk about the specific card types, but I think that the design is really excellent, and I am going to continue my trend here of highlighting specifically elves, because I think that's going to be the path of least resistance for some cubes that maybe have enough elves incidentally support this kind of thing. But the card is High Perfect Morcant, 2 green black for a 4/4 legendary elf noble. Whenever High Perfect Morcant or another elf you control enters, each opponent blights 1. So they put a -1/-1 counter on a creature they control, and then you can tap 3 untapped elves you control to proliferate, which you activate only as a sorcery. So this makes it so all of your fiddly mana elves, your Llanowar elves, maybe you have stuff like Elvish Visionary, is going to start causing your opponent to put a -1/-1 counter on the creature. And if you get to the point where you have 3 elves and you can start proliferating, then you make it so they kind of want to spread their counters out. So either they're blighting onto the same thing as you cast more elves and then the things start dying, or if they want to spread it out, then you're able to proliferate and cut things down that way. This is kind of the space of a Punisher mechanic. Your opponent gets the choice. If they have multiple creatures, it's generally not going to work out in the way that is most advantageous to you. But the fact that this is a repeatable effect, that you get to proliferate and scale up the negative impact of blighting your opponent, makes it so that High Perfect Morcant is a card that can have a really real impact on the battlefield. As a 4/4, it's a very reasonable thing on 4 mana to ramp into if you have these mana elves, and it's the kind of card that will slow down your opponent's early development as your elf deck presumably ramps into even more big things from there. So this seems like a really nice card to explore. Definitely if you're already playing heavily in elves, I like this for breaking up creature mirrors, and this is one that I do want to bring to people's attention in case you just have a decent clip of elves and maybe want this payoff that does stuff sometimes and is a little bit more innocuous more of the time, which can be a good use for a gold card, something that only makes your deck some of the time. That's going to be the kind of thing that you value more highly if you already are picking up green and black elf creatures. The other Blight cards that I want to talk about are ones that use it in that additional cost space. So the first is Requiting Hex. Requiting Hex is a 1 black mana instant. As an additional cost to cast the spell, you may blight 1, so put a -1/-1 counter on a creature you control, and then you destroy target creature with mana value 2 or less. If you pay the additional cost, you gain 2 life. So for the most part, this is a 1 mana black removal spell, always kills your opponent's 1 or 2 drop, doesn't actually scale the same way that a card like Fatal Push does, where if you revolt, that can destroy a 3 or a 4 mana value creature. You just can gain some life if you're able to blight. So really, this is less of a card that does anything that is that meaningful with blight. This is more a card that is going to gain you a little bit of life, but will always be able to destroy a small creature. Really good sideboard card in a cube that has some aggressive decks, some controlling decks, and then a very main deckable card if your cube is largely built around small creatures engaging in combat. So home run for the tempo Tubert for me here, and then a retail limited and certainly some other people's cubes. Blights and other counters being paid as costs, and cards having abilities to remove counters for some kind of effect. That is also where you can get paid off a little bit for using Requiting Hex. So, some stuff going on in the set to explore there in more niche spaces. Mostly, this does what it says on the tin. It's an efficient removal spell for cheap creatures. Requiting Hex definitely going to show up in a lot of spaces, just playing face up, doing that. Next up is Scuzzback Scrounger, 1 in a red for a 3/2 Goblin Warrior that says at the beginning of your first main phase, you may blight 1. If you do, create a treasure token. So if Scuzzback Scrounger is the only thing you have going on, you can put a -1/-1 counter on it, make a treasure token that can ramp you from 2 to 4. Couple things to call out. This ability triggers at the beginning of your first main phase. So the turn you cast Scuzzback Scrounger, you can't just trigger it at the beginning of combat. You've already entered your first main phase before you can cast it. So there's a kind of a turn of build there. It is worth pointing this card out, though, because it is a repeatable source of treasure tokens. So while it's not the strongest just beatdown creature or ramp spell, really, it's kind of awkward and clunky in both respects. It is a solid support for any environment where treasure tokens really matter. So I like Scuzzback Scrounger. It's kind of a neat mana ramp in red. Very simple card, which I like there, and can open up synergies with stuff like Academy Manufactor. So, some space to explore with this one, and it is relatively simple and clean, and that is always something I like to celebrate and draw attention to in 2026 Magic. So I do like Scuzzback Scrounger, even though I personally do not currently have any plans to cube with the card. And that brings us to a mechanic, a cycle of cards that is very mechanically complex. Very flavorfully resonant, very cool here, but there is a cycle of legendary creatures. It's more than 5, but it's only looks like there are 7 total. So I'm going to call it a cycle. I think that 7 cards can be a cycle. But anyway, these are rare legends that have their double-faced cards, and both sides have an ability where at the first of your main phase you can pay 1 mana, and if you do, you transform them. So legendary cards that you cast on one side, I suppose there's an Oko that's a planeswalker. The other ones are all legendary creatures. So you cast them on one side. They have an ability for 1 mana of the color of the opposite side. At the beginning of your first main phase, you can transform them, and the back side will have some other ability that tend to do something when they enter, or just like the Oko, of course, is a planeswalker, so it has abilities you can use, and then something different happens when they transform. Either with the Oko, the other side has different loyalty abilities, or the other creatures tend to have some other ability, either a static ability or an ability that triggers when they transform. So these cards are Brigid, Clashan's Heart, Irdu, Carrier of Dawn, Oko, Lorwyn Liege, Sig, Wanderwine Wisdom, Grub, Storied Matriarch, Ashling Rekindled, and Tristan, Callous Cultivator. I'm not going to read all these cards. I'm certainly not going to read both halves of all these cards. Some of this stuff is kind of typely focused. The Oko is actually pretty modest and, dare I say, kind of weak for a Planeswalker. Thank goodness we have a weak Oko so we can tune it out and not pay attention to him. In the most part, though, I find this mechanic somewhat troubling in terms of cube design, at least in terms of putting this in my cubes to play with the people that I play with. These are going to be two-sided cards. I have developed an aversion to a lot of double-faced cards, particularly when players have to read both sides. Once a specific double-faced card becomes very familiar, Or I do have more of a fondness for two-faced cards where one side is a land, where it's very easy to quickly understand this card enters the battlefield tapped, taps for blue. All of these cards have a lot of text, and all of these cards have the ability to transform to the other side every turn. And so it's even more complicated than reading two sides of a card and deciding which card to play, because both players are really brought into this game of what is my opponent going to do with this card next turn? What side is it going to be on? I imagine in games where players are not familiar with these cards, there's going to be a lot of reading of both sides for both players. And this is a mechanic that I think could really slow the game down for that reason, similar to day and night. But the calculus of paying a mana every turn, the fact that this is gated by simply paying a mana relative to even original werewolves, where you know if zero spells are cast, you know if two spells are cast, and you can kind of have an idea of, okay, what happens when this card transforms? How bad is it for me? With these ones, you're thinking, okay, does my opponent have a mana to transform this thing? Is it going to be appealing to spend the mana to do that? And then what does the other side of the card do? This is a lot of complexity for one card. I do like some of these designs. Mercifully, a few of them, there's the Oko that I think is not very strong, thankfully. And then some of them go pretty heavily into typal territory. Like Grub is very much a goblin card, Tristan is an elf card. And so I think that they're maybe worth exploring. You can spend some of the complexity points in your design on that with stuff that's as easy to approach or at least mechanically simple as creature type matters. But I think that these cards, it's going to be a big ask for me to put any of these to my cube. But let's talk about at least one of them, because there's some cool stuff mechanically happening, potential appeal for these cards. Let's start with the poster child of the set, Irdu, Carrier of Dawn. 3 white white for a flying lifelink 5/5 elemental god that says creature spells you cast have convoke. And then the backside, you can transform it at the beginning of your first main phase for 1 black mana into Isulu, Carrier of Twilight, a legendary and elemental god, also with flying and lifelink, that says each other non-token creature you control has persist. So when it dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. And then, of course, at the beginning of your first main phase, you may pay white to transform it back into Irdu. So just generally, 5 mana, 5/5, flying, lifelink, pretty appealing stats. All your stuff gains convoke. Reasonable. Once you already have 5 mana, you can use this to ramp into even larger creatures. For the most part in 2-player games, 5 mana, 5/5 flying lifelink kind of a game ender. And if you have black mana, transforming it and giving your other creatures persist is a pretty big deal in keeping the pressure up. This is the kind of thing your opponent probably wants to answer it right away. I'm not going to be slotting this into any of my cubes. This definitely feels like more of a commander card, but it's worth talking about because this card is really showing off, and this mechanic generally, these transforming legends, this is showing off aesthetically what's happening in the story, and it's a mechanical way to convey that, where Irdu specifically, I'm going to get a loss. The Vorthos are going to fact check me here, but basically you have the god of day and night, and they kind of move through space. And in Lorwyn versus Shadowmoor, there are 2 planes that exist simultaneously, but if it's day, you're a good Lorwyn folk, and if it's night, you're a spooky denizen of Shadowmoor. And so you're the same person, but you go through kind of an identity crisis where you have different memories. You're still you, but you're the Shadowmoor version of you at night, or the Lorwyn version of you during the day. And whether the Harbinger of the Sun or the Harbinger of Night is present there, either the Carrier of Dawn or the Carrier of Twilight impacts a lot about who you are and your perception of yourself, which is pretty cool. And a big part of this story is, I guess, some folks from Strixhaven showed up and they accidentally caused these gods to be in motion and really disrupted the harmony of the plane. But anyway, mechanically showing off transforming and the fact that anybody can change into anything and kind of the chaos of day and night happening on this world. So cool way to mechanically show off that. I'm glad they did not do a ton of cards doing this and didn't go really heavy on modal cards and just kind of highlight this on a handful of cards because I do think that this mechanic is really complex and tricky to navigate. Eardew is relatively simple. The fact that a 5 mana, 5/5 flying lifelink does just do a pretty good job of ending the game. This one doesn't require a lot of reading back and forth. If the Oko, the Planeswalker, ends up being strong, which I don't think it will, but if it does end up being strong, reading two sides of a Planeswalker and flipping back and forth just to get a feel for what loyalty abilities your opponent has access to, that's aggravatingly complex. I think that Brigid Clashon's Heart is pretty meaningfully appealing for any kind of go wide, big mana creature deck. Rooted in Celestia, it transforms into kind of a Gaia's Cradle card. Sig Wanderwine Wisdom is pretty nice for any kind of blue-white aggressive deck. Definitely if you're doing Merfolk matters, but just making players explore blue-white as an aggressive kind of archetype instead of a controlling one. The card is appealing in that front. I'm not going to read all the text on these cards. Check them out if you have an appetite for this two-sided mechanic, but I am kind of firmly putting my foot down and saying that this mechanic really does not appeal to me. I think that aesthetically, and certainly for Vorthoses who are a fan of what's happening in the world of Lorwyn, really cool design. It's just something that is very high complexity in a way that I've already been pretty sensitive to in recent years in my designs, so I'm not touching any of these ones. And one last thing I want to touch on the themes and mechanics part one of my cube breakdown of Lorwyn Eclipsed here. Next week I'll be talking about a lot of individual cards, but these ones do fall into just kind of the mechanics and aesthetics of Lorwyn. There are 5 evoke elementals in Lorwyn Eclipsed, and it's a pretty cool implementation of the evoke ability. They are all 2 colors with hybrid mana. 3 of them cost 6, 2 of them cost 5. They all have evoke abilities for the 2 hybrid mana that they cost, and then they have 2 different enters abilities, both that check if 2 mana of one of their colors was paid to cast them, and you get an ability if you did that. So when you evoke them, the idea is you spend 2 of the same color and get one of those 2 abilities, and then if you pay full retail, ideally you're paying 2 mana of both of the colors and getting the full text box here. So let's look at what the cards are. There is Catharsis. This is our Boros entry for 4 and 2 red-white hybrid. You get a 3/4 elemental incarnation. When it enters, if white was spent to cast it, create 2 1/1 green and white Kithkin creature tokens. And when it enters, if red was spent to cast it, creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain haste until end of turn. Evokes for 2 red-white hybrid. Deceit is our blue-black entry for 4 and 2 blue-black hybrid. You get a 5/5 elemental incarnation. When Deceit enters, if blue was spent to cast it, return up to 1 other target non-land permanent to its owner's other hand. And when it enters, if black was spent to cast it, target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card, evoke for 2 blue-black hybrid. The black-white entry is Emptiness, 4 and 2 black-white hybrid for a 3/5 elemental incarnation. When this creature enters, if white was spent to cast it, return target creature with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. When it enters, if black was spent to cast it, put 3 -1/-1 counters on up to 1 target creature, and then evokes for 2 black-white hybrid. Vibrance is our Gruul entry for 3 and 2 green-red hybrid. You get a 4/4 elemental incarnation with when this creature enters, if red was spent to cast it, this creature deals 3 damage to any target. And when it enters, if green was spent to cast it, search your library for a land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. You gain 2 life, evoke for 2 green-red hybrid. And finally, Wistfulness is our Simic entry for 3 and 2 blue-green hybrid. You get a 6/5 elemental incarnation with when this creature enters, if green was spent to cast it, exile target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. And when this creature enters, if blue was spent to cast it, draw 2 cards, then discard a card, and of course evokes for 2 green-blue hybrid. So you have a couple different implementations of the design here. Of course, these cards all have different modes, but some of them give you two modes where when you do both, they synergize. So Catharsis makes a couple 1/1s, and then if you pay the red mana as well, you +1/+1 and haste your team. So you make a ton of hasty power. Notably, it will give itself +1/+1 and haste. So when you cast that one for 6, you get a ton of hasty power. Deceit is another example of synergizing abilities where you have a bounce effect and a discard effect stapled together. If you only have 2 mana to spend, then you choose whichever is more desirable for the game. But then for 6 mana, you can kind of cleanly answer a permanent by bouncing it and then causing your opponent to discard it. Emptiness is more disjointed. You have recursion ability and removal ability, so that one is going to more readily evoke and just do whichever of the recursive effects or the removal effect is more appealing, and it's just a good rate card when you cast it for 6. It's probably the least appealing entry into the cycle for that reason. I think that it's kind of a couple effects that you can get a lot of different cards that is not the best thing to be spending 6 mana on. I kind of think that one would be reasonable to rate at 5 mana. I think both of the 5 mana entries are a lot more appealing than Emptiness, and the other two 6 mana entries, they are more appealing because they have synergistic abilities, but it's still a strong and a cool card. I'm a huge fan of Vibrance, either playing in a green deck and finding you any land, not just basic lands, finding you any land, gaining some life, or being a removal spell. Importantly, it does damage to any target, so if you're a more red deck, this is sort of like a Flametongue Kavu. It's like Sylvan Scrying, Flametongue Kavu hybrid, but also stabled together card. I'm a huge fan of Vibrance. Wistfulness is also very useful as an answer to artifacts and enchantments. That can be some card selection, and it being a 6/5 is just gigantic. But mostly what I love about this cycle, when you compare this to, say, the Modern Horizons Evoke cycle of the pitch elementals, those ones are so filthy with Evoke, and they are strong to bring to the battlefield. They have their presence really significantly felt in the highest power cube environments. They have been ruinous to multiple constructed environments and still see play of the ones that are legal. And part of that is they are really strong to cheat into play, be that ephemerate and blinking them, be that reanimating them from the graveyard. What I love about this new cycle of elemental incarnations is you only get the effects if you pay the mana. So you are required to play these cards honestly. They are strong modal spells. When you evoke them, you get something that is worth about 2 mana. Maybe it's overcost, but like half of a mana. But all of these effects are pretty reasonable. And then if you're paying a 5 or 6 mana creature, you get two effects that tend to both be pretty appealing. You know, setting Emptiness aside, I think that that one is kind of the least appealing of the cycle by a wide margin. But it's still fine. Both of the 2 mana abilities are something you're happy to evoke out. And I love that you just have to play these as honest creatures. We have so much in the space of cheating on mana, getting way ahead in terms of payoffs and use of our mana, ways to kind of work around whatever restrictions on a card. These ones say if you do not pay the mana when this creature enters, you get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir. I love that. Forcing you to actually cast these cards honestly. Vibrance is jumping off the page as something that I'm very excited to add to the original recipe Tubert, because both of those modest modes are really appealing. I like what this card looks like as a 5 mana spell as well. I'm a huge fan of this cycle. I think it's really well done. And there is also kind of space to explore if you are interested in doing something a little less honest with these. I have a friend who's really excited to cast some of these alongside Up the Beanstalk and Legacy, so you can certainly get some advantages out of casting stuff for less than its intended mana cost with Evoke, but not stuff that's so heavy-handed as pitch casting Grief or Solitude and ephemerating them or reanimating them. These ones are way more modest, and I'm a bigger fan of them by a lot for that reason. And that's going to do it for part one of my Lorwyn Eclipsed cube review, the mechanics and themes of the set. I have a lot more to talk about next week in terms of individual cards. So next week I'm not going to be talking about stuff that features with any of those mechanics. I've already talked about all the Vivid and Blight cards I'm going to talk about. Honestly, there's not a ton of it. I have made mention of all of these very specific typal stuff, but next week I'm talking about things that have kind of broader appeal that are going to fit into more cube environments, stuff that stands out a little bit more just in terms of normal games of Magic without any specific focus or jumping through any hoops. I do think that the more specific stuff, it's going to be easier if a player says I'm building a Goblins cube. There's not going to be a lot of friction for you to find the Goblin cards you care about. And I think it's more meaningful to look at the rate and general appeal of cards more in aggregate. So that's what I'm going to be talking about next week. Thank you so much for everybody to taking the time to listen today. Again, I am very grateful for anybody that spends some time and is able to donate to any of those grassroots organizations, any mutual aid groups, certainly focused here in Minneapolis, and anybody that's taking some time to look into what is going on in your own community, helping out your neighbors, just helping out ordinary people in the world. We are all that we have. Thanks again, everybody, and I'll be back next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.